Our next presentation will address the priorities and focus of FDA inspection plans for 2022. We're pleased to welcome Dave Fairfield for this session. Dave is Senior Vice President of Feed Services for the National Grain Feed Association. He joined NGFA in July 2001 after spending 20 years managing operations for commercial feed companies. As Senior Vice President of Feed Services, he is NGFA's primary staff person that addresses food and feed safety issues. Dave participates as a subject matter expert within a variety of food and feed safety forums, including the Association of American Feed Control Officials, Global Food Safety Initiative, and International Organization for Standardization. He is also currently chairs the Animal Food Committee within the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, which develops and delivers educational and training materials to assess the animal food industry in complying with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Dave is a graduate from Kansas State University's Department of Grain Science in Manhattan, Kansas. Dave?
Thank you, Jess. Good morning. Got the hardy crew out here on 8 o'clock in the morning to talk about FDA issues, so that's great. I'm not sure where that picture came from that they had up on the screen. I think, Mark, you did me a lot of kindness there, showing a picture that was about 20 years old, but I've aged a little bit, so thank you for that. We'll get the technology going here. Seem to be stuck, I'm sorry. Okay, what I think I'm supposed to do today is provide everybody an update on some of FDA's inspection activities that have been occurring recently. And so to do that, I want to provide a little bit of background in terms of FDA's inspection authority. I'm sorry, this remote's still having trouble. Okay, I got it, thank you. I think it's working, yeah. So, apologize for that, but to try to give you an update on FDA's inspection activity, I want to cover some other topics first, just to give everybody some background, kind of put us on a baseline of understanding of FDA's authority, some of the regulations that impact the grain and feed industry, talk more specifically about FSMA regulations, which are kind of the new thing for our industry. Talk a little bit about what's next in terms of FDA rulemaking, and then along the way, hopefully point out a few compliance guidance, helpful tips that you can use, again, hopefully to navigate the inspection process if your facility is subject to the FDA oversight. So to begin and to provide a little bit of background about FDA's authority, here's the definition established by the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act for food. So you can see food means articles for food for man or for animals. Chewing gum, I'm not exactly sure where chewing gum came from, but it's in there. And then the third clause there, articles used for components of any such article. So I'm not a lawyer, but that's good legal speak to say that, you know, really anything that's used for food is food. So according to FDA's authority, the intended use of a product really establishes whether or not that ingredient or that component, that article, is classified as food within FDA terminology. So we've got a lot of grain elevator managers here that distribute grain. If you distribute it for animal food use or feed use, it's food. If you distribute it to a grain processing facility that manufactures human food, that's human food. And so that's how FDA would go about that. If you distribute corn for an industrial use, then it's not food. So it's really the intended use of the product that establishes whether it's food under U.S. law. So within the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the whole goal within the legal system is to prevent food adulteration and also prevent food misbranding. So on this slide, I've listed some of the criteria by which FDA can deem or call a food to be adulterated and not fit for its intended use. And so I'm not going to go through this laundry list of criteria, but I think that there are a couple things that are specifically important for you to know. The first one is FDA has the authority to deem a food to be adulterated, which is bad, if it's not produced in conformance with applicable FDA regulations. And so my example there is you could produce a food that is completely safe in every respect, but if it's not produced in conformance with FDA regulations, the agencies still have authority to deem that food to be adulterated. So compliance with regulations is important in addition to all the other safety factors that may go into the food that you distribute. Another thing that I think is important within the definition of adulteration and criteria is that obviously if it contains any poisonous, deleterious substance which may render it injurious to health. So, in our space with grain and feed, mycotoxins could be an example of a poisonous or deleterious substance that could render a food to be unsafe or unfit for its use. So that's adulteration. So in terms of misbranding, FDA has authority to make sure that food is labeled correctly. So here's the criteria by which FDA could deem a food to be misbranded: if it's labeled in a false and misleading manner, or if it's purported to contain some sort of component that it actually does not contain. So misbranding issues are not really that big a deal for a lot of our industry. If you're in the feed business, you've probably got state labeling requirements that you're obligated to follow. So you follow those requirements, you're going to meet the misbranding standards that the FDA and the states establish and not run into any issues, really. FDA's primary focus is on preventing adulteration. Misbranding is more often a state issue. So within the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the whole goal is to prevent adulteration. The goal is to prevent misbranding. And the agency has broad authority to issue emanating regulations from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to reach those two goals. And so what I've done on this slide is just list kind of a laundry list of regulations or things that FDA has promulgated that have the potential to impact the grain and feed industry. So sanitation provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act could apply. This relates to housekeeping and pest control within facilities that we operate. I already mentioned FDA's action, advisory, or guidance levels for mycotoxins. That's an issue that we need to be obviously always familiar with within our industry at our facilities. There's BSE prevention regulations. There's records access that the FDA has authority to in case you have some sort of, you've distributed a product that has caused a serious adverse health consequence to animals or to humans. You need to be aware of FDA's regulatory authority in that respect as well. Food facility registration, I'll talk a little bit more about that. The reportable food registry, record-keeping requirements, and the list goes on. FSMA regulations as well. And so my main point in mentioning these things is that FSMA's gained a lot of traction over the last 10 years, but there's a variety of requirements that our industry is already subject to before FSMA. And you need to be aware of what these requirements are and how they apply to your given operation. So I mentioned before a couple of these items I wanted to drill down a little bit more on. First one is food facility registration. When this was enacted back in the 2000s because of the Bioterrorism Act, this used to be a one-time event. Now, food facilities, including grain elevators, grain processors, feed mills, a variety of facilities are obligated to register with FDA every 2 years on even-numbered years during the last quarter of those years. So here we are, it's 2022, it's an even-numbered year, and so you're obligated to re-register your food facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold human or animal food intended for consumption in the U.S. during the October 1 through December 31st timeframe. Beginning in 2020, there was a new requirement associated with food facility registration, and that was the need for each facility to establish or obtain a unique facility identifier. And what FDA did in this respect is they designated DUNS numbers as that unique facility identifier that facilities needed to complete the registration process. And so I don't know how many of you have had troubles getting DUNS numbers for your facilities, but it's been a pretty widespread occurrence. Back in 2020, when this new requirement came into play, FDA actually exercised what they call enforcement discretion. They didn't actually require the DUNS number to be completed to do your registration process. But in 2022, there is an expectation from FDA that you complete the registration process and have a DUNS number to do so. So again, I know there's been a lot of trouble in obtaining those numbers. FDA, in fact, is having a webinar coming up on August 11th to kind of go over the facility registration process and the need to have a DUNS number. So if that is a topic of interest to you, I just wanted to make you aware of the opportunity that to participate in a webinar that FDA has coming up. The agency is also taking questions for that webinar if you might have one. And so if you might have a specific question related to a DUNS number, for instance, you can register for the webinar, submit those questions to FDA. They want those by July 29th. So just to make you aware, again, of that opportunity. Wanted to also highlight FDA's record-keeping requirements that have been around for a long time for our industry. And I guess I highlight these because I think that there's kind of maybe a lack of knowledge about these requirements and the need to have certain records in place. And so, again, in accordance with the Bioterrorism Act, the regulations were put in place that really require one step back, one step traceability of food as it moves through your facility. And this requirement applies to feed mills, it applies to grain elevators, grain processors, anybody that's really obligated to register as a food facility with FDA. So you need to establish and maintain records to identify the immediate previous source of your food that you bring into your facility, like who your suppliers are, and then also records that identify the immediate subsequent recipient or who you send food to when it leaves your facility. In addition to that, you're supposed to use reasonably available information to be able to link inbound shipments to outbound shipments. And so this type of record-keeping requirement has been in place for a number of years, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to remind folks of that. For manufacturers of food, feed mill type of operations, if the ingredients that you receive in have lot numbers, you're supposed to be able to link the lot numbers of those ingredients to the lot numbers or specific lots of outbound product that leave your facility as well. So FSMA itself didn't change these traceability requirements. These have been in place for a long time. And again, as I'm out in the industry talking to folks, there seems to be some degree of unfamiliarity with these requirements, so it's just an opportunity to remind you that these requirements are in place and you may think about how you're meeting them. And then the last kind of element that was listed on that previous slide that I wanted to focus on is FDA's reportable food registry. I find when I go out and talk to folks in our industry that there's a general unawareness of FDA's requirements in this area, which simply state that if you distribute a food product, and again, you know, corn is food or feed is food, if you distribute a food product that has the potential to cause a serious adverse health consequence or death to humans or animals, you are obligated to report that to FDA within 24 hours of making that determination. So the trigger here is, you know, does this food that you distributed have the potential to cause a serious adverse health consequence? And legally, it's up to you to make that determination. So again, I'm just reminding folks in the industry of this requirement. I would say that if you do report something to FDA, you can be assured that they will be in contact with you quite quickly. You can be assured that they'll come and visit your facilities, and you'll be able to have a good conversation with them related to the incident that you reported. So I would say, though, that it's better to report rather than FDA just finding out about something on their own and showing up at a facility that has not made some sort of report. Okay, let me shift gears here a little bit and dig a little more deeply into the Food Safety Modernization Act. This isn't new news. The Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law back in January of 2011, so we've been dealing with this issue for a long time. But it did greatly expand FDA's authority to regulate the U.S. food supply. FDA's authority extends to about 80% of the food that's distributed, consumed in the U.S., so it was a big deal. And the focus was really to establish a prevention-based regulatory framework for the food industry in the U.S. to prevent food safety incidents from happening rather than just reacting to them if it did happen. So FDA under FSMA was directed to implement several new food safety regulations, which have been all completed. So FSMA, as a snapshot, had 4 major components. One was the prevention component that I just tried to describe. Another is inspections and compliance. The Congress, through FSMA, actually mandated inspection frequencies at food facilities. So again, if you're obligated to register with FDA as a food facility, and if you're here from a grain and feed facility, I'm going to say you have that obligation. What FSMA did was it mandated that your facility be inspected on a certain number, once every certain number of years. And so within FSMA, FDA was directed to inspect what FSMA called high-risk facilities every 3 years and other types of facilities every 5 years. Now, in reality, FDA does not have the inspection resources to complete that number of inspections. And so I don't know if you've had an FDA inspection or not at your facility. FDA uses a risk ranking methodology to establish their inspectional priorities. You know, what's happening at the facility, what's the potential for, a problem, what's the potential to cause, maybe widespread health issues because of that problem. So they go through a ranking system to determine how and when they're going to conduct inspections. So you may not have experienced an inspection, and simply because FSMA mandates it, if FDA does not have the resources allocated through Congress, they can't really complete that mandate. But I would say that more facilities over the last 5 years have been inspected in our industry than previously. So there are more inspections going on at grain elevators and at feed facilities than there have been in the past. A third component of FSMA relates to import safety, trying to make sure that the safety of foreign foods imported into the U.S. meets the same standards as food produced in the U.S. And then the last bullet is one of those fuzzy circles about enhanced partnerships. FDA is going to enter into agreements, capacity building exercises to expand their reach and fulfill their mission. So I would say within the animal food space, if you're here and operate a feed mill, you're probably already aware of that. But about 80% of FDA's inspections are conducted by state agencies, whether they be a Department of Agriculture or the state chemist that has authority over feed within a given state. About 80% of animal feed or feed mill inspections are conducted by states credentialed under FDA authority. So from my perspective, that's good. I think that's what I hear from our industry members as well. When a state inspector shows up and conducts an inspection, they probably have a little bit more empathy toward the facility's operation and try to work with that facility to overcome any type of compliance issues that it may have. So, but that's an example of the enhanced partnership type of work that FSMA wanted FDA to engage in. Okay, so I mentioned that FSMA required FDA to enter into rulemaking to promulgate a number of rules or issue a number of rules. And all the rulemaking's been completed. It occurred over about a 5 to 6 year period. But this slide lists what FDA calls the Big 7 rules. So you can see current good manufacturing practices and preventive controls for animal food, the same type of regulations for human food. We've got a produce safety rule that doesn't really impact our industry too much. Foreign supplier verification programs relate to importers that bring foreign food into the U.S. sanitary transportation rule for human and animal food, accredited third-party certification, and then an intentional adulteration rule. So these are the big 7 rules that FDA has finished issuing. So applicability of these rules really depends on what's happening at the facility that has to register with FDA. So what I've tried to do here on this slide is to indicate what rules have the potential to be applicable to animal food facilities. Those types of facilities would be pet food facilities or feed mills versus facilities that are not animal food facilities. So rules that could have the potential to be applicable to animal food include the CGMP and Preventive Controls rules for animal food, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, if in fact you might be an importer of foreign food, the Accredited Third-Party Certification Rule, again, that would only have utility if you're an importer of foreign food, and then sanitary transportation. So those are the major FSMA rules that could apply to your operation if you operate a feed mill or a pet food manufacturing facility. And you can see on the human food side, we've got the human food CGMPs and preventive controls, produce safety, and intentional adulteration. So applicability, though, goes a step farther than that. Again, it depends on what's actually occurring at each facility that has to register with FDA. So what I've tried to do here on this slide is list some of the major FSMA rules and the type of operations that are performed at a single facility and give you a little bit of flavor and feel what rules could apply to that type of operation. And so in terms of applicability, FDA's definition of a facility comes into play. And it's a complicated definition, but one way to think of it is really FDA considers a facility to be all the operations that occur within a legally defined piece of property. And it relates back to your food facility registration process. So, for example, if you have a food facility registration that you're completing, and you may have a grain elevator and a feed mill associated with that registration, associated with that facility, then FDA views all the activities that occur at that location as one facility, one single facility. The feed mill is not a separate facility from the grain elevator if, based on your food facility registration, you've registered them as one facility. So I hope that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But, so for example, according to FDA's applicability rules, if you're a grain elevator, the only one of these major FSMA rules that applies to you, if the only thing happening at that facility is a grain elevator operation that holds and stores raw agricultural commodities, is the sanitary transportation rule. However, if you've got a feed mill also located at the same facility as the grain elevator, then both the grain elevator and the feed mill are subject to the animal food CGMP rule and preventive control rule that FDA promulgated under the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then you can go down the list and see that a feed mill, if the facility consists only of a feed mill for animal food, you've got the CGMP and preventive controls rule and the sanitary transportation rule that would apply. And then if you happen to be a grain processor, such as a flour mill, all these rules that I've listed on this slide have the potential to apply to that type of facility. Because a flour mill produces human food, often the byproducts from the flour milling process go to animal food, so that type of facility has the opportunity to get to comply with all these rules I've listed on the slide. So that's my background. So trying to move on to the topic that I'm supposed to address, inspections. So a little bit about FDA's inspection authority. FDA really has broad inspection authority to inspect really any part or aspect of a food facility at reasonable times, reasonable manner, reasonable limits. That's all legalese again. And to really look at all types of products, all types of equipments, all types of vehicles that may be used by your company. And they don't require, there's no warrant necessary for inspection. So typically FDA conducts inspections that are unannounced. COVID kind of changed that practice to some degree. FDA, in order to conduct inspections, was contacting facilities to make sure necessary personnel might be there for the inspection. Some of that is still going on today, pre-announcements for inspections, but generally speaking, FDA historically has conducted these inspections on an unannounced basis, and essentially, if you're open for business, you're open for FDA inspection. And so, I have been in situations before where back when I was in the industry, an FDA inspector would show up. Maybe we didn't have the right people at the facility that day to facilitate the inspection well, who knew where all the programs were and could answer the FDA's questions that they wanted to pose. I have been in situations like that where I've asked investigators to come back, and some rarely accommodated, but again, that was kind of a rare occurrence. Some might, but typically they're there to conduct their work, and they expect you to be ready for them to conduct their work when they show up. So that's how the process normally works. So a little bit more about the inspection process. Historically, FDA has broken their compliance efforts into different program areas. So, for example, they may have inspectors that go out and simply inspect for compliance for a certain regulation. For instance, if you're a feed mill here, you're probably subject to FDA's BSE prevention regulations. And so in the past, FDA would send an inspector out, conduct an inspection for that regulation. Then later in the year, if you're also produced medicated feed at that feed mill, you might have another inspector come by to conduct a medicated feed inspection. So that's kind of the practice that FDA had historically. But that has changed. So FDA believes now a more efficient use of their inspection resources is to conduct all the compliance, to conduct an inspection that covers all the compliance areas that a given facility is subject to. And so what this has done is it has lengthened the inspection process fairly significantly in many respects. I was talking to somebody at our conference here last night who said that a couple feed mills that he was aware of have just completed inspections, and FDA spent the better part of 5 days conducting each of those inspections. So that's not uncommon. At the same time, inspections take place. The investigators that go out and conduct them, they're people, they have different interests. One area of focus may be a hot topic for one inspector, another area of focus may be a hot topic for that inspector. And so kind of the rigor and level of detail associated with your inspectors could be, or likely it will be, dependent upon the investigator's interests. But there is the potential that these inspections can take a long time, depending upon what's going on at your facility and the inspector that you may have the opportunity to interact with. Another thing I would say is be prepared to respond to questions or requests for information for records that FDA authority does not expressly provide. What I mean here is FDA investigators, this is part of their training. They'll pose a lot of questions to facilities that don't necessarily tie to regulatory requirements. And they pose those questions because they believe the information they have the potential to obtain could be valuable to them in assessing kind of the facility's compliance status, the risk the facility poses to the industry, things of that nature. And so it's quite common for FDA to come in and ask for complaint files, lists of top customers, suppliers, business volume information, organizational charts. Again, these things are not expressly required through FDA regulations. And so your attitude toward these inspections or your willingness to provide this type of information really just depends on the level of cooperation you want to extend to the investigator. So it's up to you. I just want to make you aware that that happens. There are also other gray areas associated with FDA's inspection authority that you need to be prepared for. One, it deals with employee interviews. I would suggest if you're subject to FDA inspections that you should have a policy that outlines how you're going to respond to FDA requests related to employee interviews. If you develop a policy that allows it, I would suggest that you have a supervisor accompany the employee. If you have a policy that prohibits it and you have an FDA investigator show up, I would suggest that you inform the investigator of that policy at the outset of the inspection, just so that everybody's clear on what your policy is. Same thing with pictures. FDA likes to take pictures, and their legal authority to do so is not clear, although FDA will allege that it likely is. So you need to develop a policy that is going to establish how you're going to deal with requests for pictures. And again, if you're going to prohibit them, I would suggest that you tell the FDA inspector that upon their arrival. They'll probably disagree with you, but just hold your ground if that's your position. In addition, I talked before about FDA's authority to inspect reasonable times, reasonable limits, reasonable manners. Some facilities get an investigator that just wants copies and copies of all sorts of records. Now, you may be obligated to provide that record. It may be required by regulation, but the volume of those records sometimes comes into question. If you get into a situation where FDA is requesting just years of records from you, it's reasonable to ask why. And it's reasonable to have a policy to deal with that. And so that's an area that sometimes comes into question during inspections, and you should be prepared to address that issue in a way that fits your policies on how you want to handle that type of inspection issue. And then the last thing I've listed here is affidavits and declarations. From time to time, FDA will conduct an inspection and ask a person of management at the facility to sign an affidavit. You're under no legal obligation to do so, and I would recommend that you not. And so be aware of that and have a policy that deals with it so that your employees understand what your policy is. A little bit more about the inspection process. If you've been through this, this is old news to you, but what FDA does is they'll complete a process and normally sit down with the management at the facility and talk about observations. And FDA uses what they call a Form 483 to list observations that they want to document that they made during the inspection process. The inspectional observation name for the Form 483 form is kind because it's more than inspectional observations, it's alleged violations that the investigator is going to make. These types of things that the investigator believes you are not in compliance with, that they observed during the inspection. So they document those alleged violations on a Form 483. Those violations will go through a review process within FDA, and depending upon the significance of that, the inspection could be classified as a no action indicated. Typically, if you have a Form 483 that's not issued, there's no alleged violations at the end of the inspection is going to be classified as a no action indicated inspection. If the alleged violations are minor in the investigator's eyes, they could classify that inspection as a voluntary action indicated type of situation. Voluntary action indicated violations typically don't end up on a 483, but they will end up on an inspection establishment report that FDA will complete after the inspection. And if you have the opportunity to be inspected at some point in the future, these voluntary action indicated types of circumstances will probably be brought up again during that subsequent inspection. And if they've not been dealt with, they could rise to the level of being more severe in FDA's eyes. And then finally, if you go through the inspection and FDA believes there are serious violations that are occurring, you get this official action indicated type of classification. Typically, FDA follows up with these official action indicated inspections with what they call a warning letter, which details the alleged violations and request the firm to respond back to the agency within 15 days about what they're going to do to take corrective action to mitigate or to correct these violations that were noted. That's how the process normally goes. At the end of the day, I know our industry is really familiar with OSHA and fines, but FDA in their enforcement authority typically does not issue fines. They can if they believe that the situation is really, really egregious. But normally what they do is they will detain product, they'll mandate recalls. They could and have in the past entered into consent decrees, which is a legal action whereby a court order is issued that mandates the facility to do certain things to alleviate the problems along the way. And then if they think the situation is really bad, they have the authority to suspend a facility's registration. And what that means is you're not allowed or legally allowed to distribute food. So essentially that shuts down your operation. Okay, inspection activity for 2022. I'm getting there. I want to make you aware that FDA, through their transparency initiative that they launched a few years ago, has lots and lots of inspection activity records available on their website. And so I know many of you aren't into this like I need to be, but this can be a useful resource if you want to find out kind of where FDA's inspection focuses are, and also what type of compliance activities they've been involved with. So this is a snapshot again of a web page that FDA has in place. One thing I wanted to point out on this snapshot is that you can actually search for firm information through this website. So you can type in the name of a company and you can access their compliance status based on FDA regulations and inspections that have been performed at that facility for a number of years. And so all this information is publicly available to you and to just everyone at large who's interested in it. So I want to make you aware of that. So a little bit about animal food inspection classifications. So getting into recent inspection activity at animal food facilities. So for the fiscal years 2021, this is just a graph that shows you how inspections have been classified according to those three classification types that I just reviewed. No action indicated, voluntary action indicated, official action indicated. So during the time period of fiscal years, this is the government fiscal year, 2021 through the present. So we're looking at the time frame of October 1, 2020 through the present. You can see that about 68% of inspections have been classified as no action indicated, 28% voluntary action indicated, and 4% as official action indicated. Gives you a little flavor in terms of what FDA is finding out there. And then this slide details the top 5 areas where citations have been issued. And these citations primarily relate to the current good manufacturing practice and preventive control rules for animal food that I previously talked about. It's one of those FSMA-related regulations that FDA issued. So if you're subject to that rule, you have to have a food safety plan. Part of that plan is a hazard analysis, and you need to implement preventive controls if necessary based on your hazard analysis. So most of these citations relate to that rule. For human food facilities, this slide gives you a little bit of a snapshot in terms of how FDA's inspection activity there is going. Quite similar to animal food facilities. You can see the number or percentage that have been designated as no action indicated, voluntary action indicated, and then official action indicated as well. So for human food facilities, here's the list of the top citations. If you're involved in a human food facility, you already understand this, but pathogen control or control of undesirable microorganisms and control of cross-contact allergens is a big deal in the human food space. Those issues are not really a big deal in the animal food space, but they are for human food. And so you can see these top human food citations A lot of them would apply to pathogen control, allergen control within human food facilities. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of emerging areas of focus within FDA's inspections. And so, FDA's went through a long rulemaking process to issue rules that prescribe certain things. And then what FDA does is they issue typically guidance documents to further describe what the rules say. But at the end of the day, it's really FDA's inspection activity that determines what the words on the paper are actually going to mean. And so we've been through about 5 years of inspections within FDA related to FSMA rules, and I think we can identify some trends, some emerging issues that are popping up through inspections today versus inspections that occurred 5 years ago. So one of those emerging areas relates to mycotoxins. So for instance, if you're a feed mill here and subject to one of the FSMA-related animal food rules, you're required to evaluate incoming ingredients for the potential for mycotoxins. But initially, within the rule, FDA really doesn't prescribe how that's supposed to happen. And FDA's inspectional approach early on, after the rule was issued, really provided quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how that evaluation might take place. But more recently, it's becoming very clear within the industry that FDA expects a certain level of testing to occur to demonstrate that mycotoxins are not going to cause an animal food or food safety problem at a facility. And so what FDA is primarily interested in are those toxins that FDA has issued action limits for, or guidance limits or advisory limits. So we're talking about aflatoxin, DON, and fumonisin. So I'm aware of several recent feed mill inspections where 483s were issued because the feed mill was not perhaps doing actual testing for fumonisin or DON. This is an emerging trend within our industry. This was not expected early on within FDA's visits to facilities, but it is today. So I think that that's a change that our industry needs to be aware of. FDA is not going to tell you how often you ought to test. They're never going to tell you you're testing too often or too much. They won't tell you what the minimum level is going to be, but they'll just tell you that they think it's inadequate if they think it's inadequate. So as an industry, we're kind of in the dark, feeling our way around until we reach a point where our level of testing for these types of mycotoxins are going to satisfy their needs. But want to make you aware of that. Another emerging area is nutrient deficiencies and toxicities. And so what I'm talking about is if you run a feed mill and you're adding some ingredient into a finished animal feed, perhaps you get too much of a given nutrient in it that has the potential for toxicity. FDA really focuses on those types of situations during current inspections. So for example, copper toxicity in sheep feed is an example there. If you run a feed mill and make sheep feed, you should be aware that sheep die because of copper toxicity. They'll die for a lot of other reasons too, but that's a specific example where FDA has a real focus on that type of issue today. And then last thing I've listed here is pathogens in pet food. It's always been an issue. FDA really views pet food as almost a human food except for the need for allergen control because it's used and stored in the home. And so FDA is placing a lot more focus on pathogen control during the inspections that they're conducting. Environmental swabbing is a common occurrence at pet food facilities now during FDA inspections to identify environmental pathogens that may be present in the environment. I also wanted to talk or just mention briefly pathogenic viruses and animal feed, that this is also an emerging issue. I think probably everybody here has heard of African swine fever. There's been a lot of recent work about the potential for animal feed being a vector or being a mechanism for transmission of African swine fever to hogs. FDA's current view on the potential for viruses in animal feed is that, again, this is an emerging issue, and they do not have compliance expectations that animal feed mills address viruses like ASF or porcine epidemic diarrhea virus or high-path avian influenza within their food safety plans. So there may be a time when FDA does have that expectation that your animal food safety plan at a facility needs to address these types of hazards, but we're not there yet. And so my advice to folks is that don't try to deal with these types of pathogenic viruses within your required animal food safety plan. I also wanted to touch on the sanitary transportation rule just briefly. A lot of talk in the industry about what this rule requires and how compliance is supposed to be achieved. If you're subject to this rule, again, if you're here representing a facility, you're subject to this rule. It applies to grain elevators, it applies to feed mills. But there's been a lot of talk about the need to identify prior cargoes to ensure the safety of the cargo that's going to be hauled in that type of conveyance next. And so to try to address that issue, NGFA was involved in a fairly lengthy process within an Ag Shipper Coalition to work with the American Associations of Railroads, their RailLink subsidiary, to build and make available an online portal application whereby you can query the portal to identify prior loads in covered hopper cars. And so if your company happens to have an existing RailLink mark or company ID, you can use this portal free of charge to identify prior cargoes in rail hopper cars that you may be using. So if that's of interest to you, I wanted to make you aware of that, that opportunity. If you don't have a RailLink mark, or if you don't have a company ID with RailLink already, I think there's a one-time fee to establish that. Last year was $500, one-time fee. I don't think it's changed. Okay, what's next in terms of FDA rulemaking that has the potential to impact our industry? We've got a few things listed on this slide that I just wanted to mention briefly. One is a rule that could establish additional traceability requirements for certain foods. And I would anticipate that the final rule is going to be issued in November of this year. I'm hopeful that it will not have an impact on our industry, the grain and feed industry. I think it definitely has the impact to impact certain human food facilities. But what FDA has done here is they proposed a food traceability list. And if your foods that you handle happen to be on this list, they're going to be subject to additional traceability requirements. Again, I'm hopeful for our industry, for facilities involved in the grain and feed, you're not going to have additional traceability requirements beyond those that I tried to summarize for you earlier in my presentation. Another rulemaking that FDA is going to engage in is they're going to revise the food facility registration requirements. And more specifically, they've been talking about revising the facility definition and the food and the farm definition. And so those definitions really trigger a lot of requirements that operations can be subject to based on the rules they promulgate. So for instance, all these FSMA-related rules that we've been talking about, it's facilities that are subject to food facility registration that need to be in compliance with those rules. And so this rulemaking has the potential to impact applicability of a lot of FDA's regulations along the way. And then I mentioned before that FDA issues guidance documents for final rules that it's already issued. I would anticipate that FDA is going to issue an animal food supply chain guidance document and then also a human food byproducts used in animal food guidance document later this year. Let me wrap up with just a couple compliance guidances or information on how maybe you can get more information if you need to related to regulatory obligations and what you can do to meet them. The first thing I wanted to point out is the Preventive Controls Alliance that is in place. The Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance is a partnership with FDA. It was developed back in 2011, shortly after FSMA was signed into law. And so what the FSPCA does, it issues a lot of training programs to help entities that are subject to FDA's FSMA rules learn what the requirements are and develop programs for compliance. If you're familiar with these rules, you will understand or already know that a number of these rules require certain activities to be performed by qualified individuals. And so FDA uses FSPCA's training programs to put forth those training criteria whereby individuals can meet this qualified training threshold and be in compliance with rules. So this is one compliance guidance thing that I want to make you aware of. And then also NGFA's guidance documents. On our website, within our members only section, we have a variety of guidance documents that we've made available. This is a snapshot of one of them. We've got a guidance document related to inspections. We've got guidance documents related to mycotoxins, a number of different resources. If you log into the NGFA website as a member, these things are available to you. So with that, Jess, that kind of wraps up my comments. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and present information. Hope that you found something useful along the way. So.
Do we have any questions for Dave? That was such a lively bunch. Is it still early?
It's a really lively topic.
Yeah,
to start
I know.
today.
It's a lively topic. Well, I just have.
When you were talking about the amount of records and what can be unreasonable as far as going back, what would be a good rule of thumb there? Like, if they come in and your last inspection was 3 years ago and they want records beyond that, is that a good point to say why? We're not necessarily going to do that.
Yeah, I think the question, I can paraphrase it. I made this comment about have a policy to establish what you think is a reasonable amount of records that you're willing to provide FDA upon request. Now, every record that you're obligated to establish and maintain is subject to FDA review and inspection. But I think the issue becomes, what if the inspector wants 3 years of records associated with some topic? And in my view, that's unreasonable. I think that, maybe a month is reasonable to demonstrate that, yeah, you're in compliance with whatever issue the investigators wants to delve into. And if they want more records, again, I would ask why. I mean, what specific issue are you looking at here? What are you trying to find so that I can provide you, meet my legal obligation to provide you the information you need. But for instance, if an inspector comes in and wants, if a facility is subject to this CGMP PC rule for animal food, and you have to have a animal food safety plan, we've had inspectors come in and ask for the entire plan. And typically, the industry response is, why? I mean, if there's a certain area that you want to look at, yeah, I'm obligated to give that to you. But unless you're digging into something, I really don't want to give you my entire food safety plan. So I hope that helps.
Are there any other questions for Dave? I just had a quick question on the sanitary transportation issue. I know that was, you briefly mentioned that, but from a compliance side, has there been anything new to report on that?
Yeah, I mentioned before, sanitary transportation, whether you're here from a grain elevator or a feed mill, that rule applies to you. It has not really been a high area of inspection focus within FDA. So I give you a snapshot of this dashboard that FDA has that lists inspection citations and inspectional information. So I looked at that website prior to this event and looked for violations associated with the sanitary transportation rule. And since this rule's been issued in 2016, there's been 6 citations issued related to the sanitary transportation rule. And all of them have related to temperature control. So if you're familiar with the rule, there's temperature control requirements, if you're transporting refrigerated food. And so clearly where there have been citations issued or inspections conducted, the area of focus has been on temperature control and not much else to this point.
Thanks. Anything else?
Yeah, quick question. I think it'll be all right.
Okay.
There was a slide earlier that there's 24-hour notification if there's concern that there's contamination that could cause harm to humans or animals. That's only, I'm assuming, if it gets out. So, like, if there's concerns of a product in-house, when you address it in-house and never get to the final product that goes out, that does not require notification, does it?
Right, let me try to paraphrase the question again. I talked about the reportable food registry and to notify FDA within 24 hours if you've distributed a product that could cause a serious adverse health consequence or death to humans or to animals. And the question really pertains to when does that reporting need to occur? I mean, if you've had a problem within your facility but you've caught it before that food leaves your facility, you don't have any obligation to report in that situation. You have an obligation to report if you've distributed the product for use. That's when that requirement comes into play.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dave. Appreciate it.
Yeah.